Thank you. Okay, yes, well, welcome everybody. Great to see you all here, and it's an honor to be speaking at the BAPT this year. My name is Max Chegwyn, and today's presentation is called Type and Shadow: Strategies for Identifying, Integrating, and Thriving. So who am I? I describe myself as a psycho-spiritual educator and coach. I'm a certified Jungian coach through Creative Mind, and a type practitioner through Type Pro, which is Angelina and Gareth's organization. I run makeitconscious.com, where I provide content, education, and coaching for self-knowledge and individuation. I've got a podcast which I update periodically. There's 10 episodes there so far. And outside of this, I've also been running an online sports supplement business for 9 years. So that's an Amazon business. Give me the time to focus on what I really enjoy, which is psychology and understanding more about the mind and spirituality. So I'm currently working on a series of guided active imagination exercises on YouTube. I noticed that there were very few guided active imagination exercises out there, which I thought was quite surprising because Jung considered it the most powerful way to engage with the unconscious mind. And whilst there are countless meditation exercises, of course, active imagination really lends itself to a guided practice. I'm also the curator of the 7 Habits of Individuation model for spiritual growth, and I will touch on that briefly in this talk. It's a combination really of modern psychology and the understanding of the unconscious mind, combined with the practices of the spiritual traditions, namely Buddhism, Christianity, and Hinduism. So this is a type conference. We're all about sharing type. My type is INTP. I'm also born in the 3rd decan of Gemini, which means I'm an Aquarian Gemini. In tarot terms, that's represented by the star, the Lover's card, and the 10 of Swords. So the Lovers being about separation, whereby spirit can manifest. It's thought of as the beginning of rational thought and the precision of intellect. The star is really about hope and freedom and looking to the future. And the 10 of Swords is often thought of as quite an ominous card, but I would beg to differ. It's really a two-sided card in many ways, and that is really the culmination of thought. It's really about thinking to a point of complete understanding, which of course is both a blessing and a curse. I'm sure many INTP can relate to that. So I hope to bring some of that into the talk with you today. I also work in cult exit and recovery, as Viv rightly mentioned. And I really believe that cult and control dynamics are a key piece of the wider individuation puzzle. Because after all, what is individuation if not breaking free of a kind of master-slave dynamic, or either side of that equation, about letting go of the expectations of others? And it's hard to imagine how one might truly individuate without having brushed up against group control dynamics and the dark side of leadership. And what put me onto this is that I myself was a member of a Buddhist-inspired group, which I gradually came to realize was exploitative. I became the leader's closest student in that group, and I was also the first key person to exit, which led to many others exiting, many of which I coached directly to help them out. Many of them went on to coach other people to leave. And I also, as part of that process and part of my own recovery, wrote this ebook, which is called the Cult Recovery Guide. And I can see that there's many folks who have also read that who were part of that group, and it has now been a very important part of their decision to leave and their own recovery and seeing that situation clearly.
Max, you went silent on us.
That was strange. Must have pressed a hotkey or something. Okay. I was introduced to type first about 12 years ago, and many of you might know Jill Parsons. She's a contemporary of my mother's. So she's a lifelong friend. She's known me my entire life. And she first typed me when I was at a career juncture all those years ago. But in my own exit from the Buddhist cult, I rediscovered type and took it to the next level of understanding. Started learning about not just the types, but also the cognitive functions and so on. So as part of that, Jill lent me Angelina's book, Shadows of Type. And this introduced me to the first time to the link between type and psychological growth. Now, of course, those two things are inextricably linked, but it was the first time I had really put two and two together and understood how this horizontal classification of type also maps to certain patterns of what we now call vertical development. And I liked the book so much that I reached out to Angelina and actually ended up becoming certified as a type assessor through Type Pro. And what was interesting to me was how the stages described in Angelina's book through models like ego development theory and spiral dynamics, how they mapped to the stages described in spiritual traditions such as Buddhism. There are some major differences, of course, because there's no religion at this time that actually incorporates an understanding of the unconscious mind. And so they tend to approach it from quite a mythical and literal perspective. But certain elements, like in Buddhism, how they talk about personal existence view and the need to let go of that. And of course, in Jungian psychology, we talk about the persona and the shadow. So it's very interesting to me to see a link there. And it's fair to say that was also key in my own recovery and doing the learning I had to do to move on. So there's really three aims to this session. The first is to provide you with type-based tools to identify shadow material in yourself and others. This will be useful whether you're a coach or whether you're just looking to work towards shadow integration yourself. The second is to introduce methods for integrating the shadow based on your type, because of course it's going to be wildly different for each type, and not only for each type, but for each person within the same type. So we're going to get onto some of that and some of the nuance, but type has been an invaluable tool for me to help really get me in the right ballpark and get my clients in the right ballpark so that we can then work with something specifically. And also it goes wider than the other tools that are available. So it tends to leave no stone unturned. If there's time at the end, this might be a tall order, but we'll look to understand how functions that are in our shadow can lead to exploitation in groups and spiritual communities. And of course, the flip side of that is that they can also lead to growth through community. This conference is, of course, all about belonging, and you can't really talk about shadow without talking about belonging. The two things are inextricably linked because it's often our shadow material that drives us into group interactions. And if that's not integrated, that can be a destructive experience. But if it is, if we've worked on our shadow, it can actually be a very nourishing experience. So it's actually essential that we have an understanding of the unconscious mind. We worked with our shadow in order to have healthy, individuated community. So first, what exactly is the shadow? Well, on one level, the shadow is merely a concept, and concepts are all good and well, but it doesn't really capture the essence of what the shadow actually is. Ultimately, a concept is just a label to help point us in the right direction. So we need to be moving beyond merely understanding the shadow as a concept and working with it as an experience. Because the shadow is an experience, and it has to be experienced in order to be integrated. If we just get stuck in trying to understand our shadow, whether it's in terms of type and the traits that we assign to that, and all the other features that are found in the shadow, we're at risk of maybe avoiding the real work, which is to actually experience the shadow and to experience the feelings that have locked in the repressed aspects of ourselves. Of course, as a result of being experienced, it's also an archetype. The shadow is something that shows up in the external world. It's part of us, it's part of our unconscious. And so we encounter it in dreams, in active imaginations, and also in the world. And in particular with people that we find difficult. These invariably reflect back to us aspects of ourselves that we've disowned. Hopefully we're a bit closer to understanding what the shadow is here, but I must stress that it's a very nebulous, nuanced thing. And I think we must always be bearing this in mind, that it is not something we can reduce to a concept. Now, with that all said, there is value in trying to break it down a little bit, trying to see it in its constituent parts as far as practically possible, because this gives us direction when we actually come to work with it. So in a nutshell, the shadow is the unconscious realm of the psyche that contains repressed aspects of the individual's personality. So what does that mean? Well, of course, that includes the traits. It's a huge part of it. And that's where type comes in largely. But the traits that are in the shadow are really a window to the rest of it. It's not enough really to say, oh, we've got extroverted feeling in our shadow, because there's going to be so much we attach to that by way of emotions, beliefs, desires, and yes, of course, archetypes. The major archetypes being the self, the shadow, the anima, the animus, and also the 12 Jungian archetypes. These can all be repressed. And the persona-shadow dynamic is mostly formed during childhood. And this occurs because, of course, as children, we're not as conscious as we are as adults. And so the experiences we have tend to leave more of an imprint on our mind. We experience pain, we experience joy. We're hardwired to try and meet the expectations of our parents for survival reasons. And so we end up identifying with certain aspects of our personality, disowning the rest. And that may help us to a point. It might help us to approximately the point of leaving home. But at some point, the way we identify is going to brush up against the shores of reality, and we're going to be forced to integrate the aspects of our personality that we've repressed. So why integrate the shadow? Well, the first reason really is because the shadow wants to be integrated. At some point, generally around midlife, can happen a little bit earlier, the shadow is going to come knocking. And this often happens, of course, when we see the midlife crisis. And it's really a process of letting go of who we think we are. But also because it's showing up in the world, we're going to be encountering people and situations that reflect back to us aspects of ourselves that we have disidentified with. Now, it may be possible to push the shadow away perpetually, but beyond a certain point, that's not going to lead to a very fulfilling life. And what tends to happen if we try and push it away is it just compounds. It's like it has a mind of its own almost. It has this kind of automaticity to it where it's just trying to get out there, trying to get our attention. And generally, the more we push it away, the more it bites back. But I really consider the benefits to be falling under the internal and the external benefits. So the internal benefits being really psycho-spiritual growth, increased self-knowledge, greater freedom, because we're no longer acting from an unconscious place. We know why we're doing what we're doing. We have control over what we're doing. And as a result of making it conscious, we're then able to really see things and other people as they really are, not merely through the lens of our own attachments and unresolved feelings. And of course, the other side of the coin is in our relationships, we then come to accept and understand other people more. We are able to make choiceful relationships, whether with other individuals or with communities at large. We're no longer seeking these communities from the perspective of the shadow. The rational ego thinks we're getting into a group because it's teaching me spiritual knowledge, it's going to help me evolve, it's going to help me reduce suffering or whatever it is. But really, maybe there's a shadow aspect that's saying, haha, I actually want to get, more understanding so that I can be powerful. Maybe I want to have recognition, right? So these are aspects of our own personality that need to be honored and made conscious in order to have more choice and freedom. Hence why shadow work is vital for healthy, individuated communities to exist. Carl Jung agreed. He said that we have not understood yet that the discovery of the unconscious means an enormous spiritual task, which must be accomplished if we wish to preserve our civilization. Very strong words. And I think it's because the religions of old, as valuable as many of the lessons taught by religion are, because they don't include an understanding of the unconscious, they maybe on their own cannot advance a person to the point necessary for individuation in today's world, in this globally connected, very complex world where we're crying out for new ways to connect with the unconscious mind. As people have really thrown away religion over the last 100, 150 years, the number of people attending churches is just plummeting. We've actually lost something vital, and that is a way of connecting with the deepest parts of ourselves. So it's vital that we find a way of doing it. So now I'm going to move into the main section of this presentation, and I want to share with you some tools for identifying shadow material in yourself as well as in your clients. So just with a caveat though, whilst identifying the shadow is absolutely vital, we need to be able to see it intellectually, understand it, maybe even give it a name, give it words, give it labels. But in essence, we must understand it's not a thing. It cannot truly be grasped or captured. It must be experienced. If we're trying to avoid experiencing it, it's most likely it's a defense mechanism by the ego. So to this end, there's two primary techniques that I use, and they are, of course, personality type on one hand, and Jungian coaching on the other hand. They both derive from Jung, of course, but they have quite a different approach. And I found that combining the two can be very effective. With personality type, the emphasis is on lesser developed cognitive functions. For example, the tertiary, the inferior, and also the shadow functions. And the benefit of that is that it goes wide. Like we're looking at all the possible places where the shadow might be hanging out. But on the other hand, you have Jungian coaching, and here the emphasis is on the qualities or traits that we assign to the shadow. So what is it we're noticing in these triggering situations and these other people that we find difficult? Do we find them domineering? Do we perceive them as arrogant or pushy? And then we're looking at the associated feelings and the desires and impulses associated with that. So whilst personality type goes wide, Jungian coaching goes deep. And there's pros and cons to each of those. One drawback of the personality type method on its own is that it can be tempting to assume that the shadow is hanging out in one of the functions, like often the inferior function. But this is not necessarily always the case. And even where it is the case, it's almost invariably also the case that the shadow is also applying to other functions as well. So it's actually possible to have shadow elements across all of your functions, even the dominant function. Like we tend to think that if it's your dominant, it's fully conscious, fully developed, and there's no resistance to using that function. But actually, in a lot of people, there's aspects of even the dominant function that have been repressed and not fully realized. So to that end, I would like to share with you a method that I use, and I refer to it as shadow classes. It's very simple. Basically, it means we're looking for where the center of gravity is in this person's shadow and which function does it mostly map to. Like I said, there's going to be multiple, but there's probably one that really stands out. And so whereas in the Jungian coaching method, we're just looking at situations and traits that they find displeasing other people, here we're sort of trying to understand what that's really about. And this is where the beauty of type comes in, because it may not be that we necessarily find someone arrogant. Maybe it's that it's their prowess in organizing people that we find displeasing, because maybe that's a part of us that we kind of need to integrate. So the class system is very simple. Essentially, it corresponds to whichever function person is pushing away the most. Now, in the sample of people I've looked at, which is about 20 people, the inferior function plays a significant role, probably around 50 to 60% of the time, or at least the main role. So that's common enough for it to be a pretty useful rule of thumb. Like half the time, the inferior is going to be involved in quite a big way. But it's nowhere near enough for it to be a hard and fast rule. We need other techniques. And like I said, not only do people resist the inferior, they resist the dominant, the auxiliary, all the way down the stack. So we're going to look at some examples now of how this might apply. In the case of an INTP, here is how possible shadow material might show up. A class 1 INTP might, for example, have learned not to speak their truth, because one of the gifts that INTPs bring to the world is radical honesty. And, they are the truth tellers, right? They are the whistleblowers. And that's often not welcome, but it's a vital role in society. We need people to do that. But if an INTP young is speaking up and saying that doesn't make sense to me, and I'm not going along with this, highly likely that's going to be discouraged by the adults in their life. Likewise, for class 2, extroverted intuition, INTP might have what I call a mad professor shadow. So whilst really they want to be out there exploring, trying things, pushing buttons, again, society and maybe their parents has discouraged that. So they've actually learned to repress the mad professor in them. And interestingly here, class 4, so obviously extroverted feeling can show up in a desire for recognition, a dislike of passive aggression, but it may also be a tendency to go along with what other people want, what other people decide. And that can actually become quite unhealthy if they're not thinking for themselves and what makes sense to them. Okay, with INFJ, there's probably many INFJs here. So I've worked with INFJs who very much fell into class 1. Like they had such a proficient use of introverted intuition that they were essentially psychic. And this didn't go down well with people, right? Like knowing when their colleague was about to be made redundant, for example, and they did not want to be seen as witchy. So, or weird, these are the words that were used to describe how they didn't want to be perceived. So very clear example of shadow material, but pertaining to the dominant function. But then of course, a class 4 INFJ who has extroverted sensing in their shadow, this is very likely to show up in the form of a propensity for impulsivity. This might be a tendency to drink, not know their limits, or to make impulse buys and so on. So this class model is really a way to help increase the efficiency of your own coaching, and also to look at yourself and go, okay, like, where might there be shadow material that's pertaining to each of my functions? And where is the critical mass of material hanging out? So then we move on to the Jungian coaching method. This really goes deeper. So once we've identified where the shadow is hanging out, we can actually try and build a bit of a clearer picture of it. So what we tend to do is when we're working with a client, and you can do this with yourself as well, it's naturally harder to do with yourself because, of course, the shadow is concealed from us because it's associated with a lot of painful feelings, so we don't like to go there. But this is nonetheless something you can try. First, bring to mind an event that is upsetting or a person you find displeasing. Then identify the feeling. Like, can you find it in the body? It could be anywhere. It could be head, chest, legs. Is it dull? Is it cold, warm? Maybe even give it a visual element. Does it have a color, a shape, a texture? And then we ask them to describe the person. So, be really mean if you want to. We're just going to sort of say, what would you call them if you weren't afraid of judgment? Well, they'll be domineering, cruel, selfish. Okay, so why is it so bad to be like them? Now, there may be some obvious answers to that, but we really want to hear it in their words. Like, why is it so bad to be domineering? And what would happen to that person if they never stopped being domineering? Like, what would be the tragedy if they never changed? And so we're tapping in here to the client's root fear, finding what it is that they're really defending against. And once we've got that, we go, how do you avoid being like this person? How would you describe yourself? It might be, well, I try to be kind. My friends call me a kind person. I'll try to be very aware, very giving. So you go, okay, what would be the opposite of those words you've used to describe yourself? You might say, well, unkind, mindless. And this is where we can start coaching them to see that what they've encountered in the other person, as much of an injustice as it may be, is nonetheless a reflection of their own shadow material. And it's that root fear they're defending against. So they don't want to be like them because it reminds them of that root fear, whether it's a fear of abandonment, being alone, not being good enough, whatever it is. And then we say, well, do you think you avoid being the light aspects of the shadow because you're afraid of being seen as the dark aspects? So, do you struggle with being assertive because you don't want to be seen as bossy? Or do you struggle with getting adequate rest because you don't want to be seen as lazy or perceived as not good enough? So how would it be if your father thought you were lazy, right? And usually that taps into some really deep-rooted stuff. And from there, we can then go into an exercise where we really get in touch with the felt sensation of the feeling that's being hidden there. And I actually have an exercise published on YouTube for that. It's called the Emotional Integration Meditation. So some key takeaways here in this first section, which is identifying the shadow. The first is that the shadow cannot be reduced to a cognitive function. In addition to traits, you've also got feelings, you've got beliefs, you've got archetypes. So there's a lot more to it than just a function, but the function can be a window to the shadow material. And that can make for much more effective coaching. Every shadow is different, even between two INTPs, even between two class 4 INTPs. It could be that they both have extroverted feeling in the shadow as their inferior function. But it might be that for one, that's showing up as a unconscious drive for a kind of power and recognition in groups, maybe manifesting in quite an unhealthy way. Like maybe it's the desire to be in charge of a group and organize that group based on the needs of the people in it. But on the other hand, it might be that another INTP is struggling with going along with what other people decide for them because they're not comfortable in their use of extroverted feelings. So you can see how, even though the function can be a window to the shadow material, it can be still very, very different for two different people. And of course, the feelings and the beliefs associated with that are also going to be very different. And the third key takeaway here is that any function in your stack can relate to the shadow, not only the inferior, not only the tertiary, not even just the shadow functions, what we call the shadow functions, which is the 5th to the 8th function in the stack. We need to be careful with our terminology here, because what I refer to as the shadow is not the same as the shadow functions. The shadow functions are opposing to the first 4 functions, but that's not the same as the shadow, which is this realm of repressed material which I am discussing here. And John Beebe's work, for example, talks about how the shadow functions bring a certain energy to what people resist. So he's referring more to like the way people react depending on which function is in play or is being triggered. And what I'm focusing more on here is what exactly is it that triggers you? So it's 2 different things. Okay, so moving into the second key point here, this is how to integrate the shadow based on type. As Jung said, there can be no transforming of darkness into light and of apathy into movements without emotion. And this is just to remind us that shadow work is energetic, emotional work. It's insufficient to just think about it or just put a ring around the shadow, put it in a box and say, yeah, I see it now. I've got extroverted feeling in my shadow. I've been going along with other people's wishes all this time, done my shadow work. And I think it's important to note that personally, I don't think shadow work ever really ends. And I think if there's ever a time when we're tempted to think our shadow work has ended, it's very likely that the ego is trying to convince us that we don't have to grow anymore, that we don't any longer have to take responsibility for our mind. So whilst I think there is a line that's crossed once we start doing that, and once the bulk of it is there, is seen and realized and integrated, I don't think it's ever really done. And there's it starts getting into sort of gray areas between what do we call shadow and what do we call just unconscious content more broadly. But technically, the shadow would be the repressed aspects of the personality, which really stands in opposition to the persona. So it's like the way we identify, the way we show up to the world. The opposite of that is the shadow. Okay, so spiritual growth, psychological growth, are they really any different? It's a 2-pronged task of coming to insight on one hand and facing up to feeling on the other. So coming to insight is essential. You cannot develop psychologically without insight. But really, it is a process of facing up to feeling, because it's the feeling that locks the shadow in. It's the feeling that compels us to act from that place. And once we work through the feeling, there's nothing to defend against anymore. So working through that is essential. But on the other hand, it's not enough to just face up to feeling. You've also got to come to insight, because that would just be firefighting. It's insight that helps one to keep moving forward. And so these 2 tasks, insight and facing up to feeling, they're really 2 sides of the same process. So how do we face up to feeling? Well, during a coaching session, we might encourage the client to get in touch with how does it feel to be perceived as the negative aspects of the shadow? How do you feel if your parents or your childhood friends, if they thought you were lazy, for example? Where does that come up in the body? So we then give that feeling our complete bare attention, not trying to give it a label, not trying to think about it, but as a direct, raw experience. Like, what are we actually experiencing? Because all we ever fear really is a feeling in the body. We think it's being abandoned, public speaking, but really it's a feeling, right? It's the mind gives it a concept after that, which we call an emotion, but it's really this felt sensation that we're defending against. So, like I said, there is an exercise for that. The EIM, you can do that at my Active Imagination playlist via the URL, you see that. But key to this also is the fact that shadow work is a way of life. And this is where the spiritual traditions have really excelled in the past. They've given people a way of life for developing their consciousness to a point that even though they don't necessarily know that they're engaging with their own unconscious mind through the rituals and so on, all the religious traditions offer a way of conducting yourself in the world, a way of practicing mental discipline, and a model for understanding the world, for navigating daily experience. Modern psychology, on the other hand, really focuses on our understanding, which with the unconscious mind, this is absolutely essential in today's world. And it's really giving us like a model and a map that surpasses what the religions have provided. So I think that for individuation, we really need to combine both of these things. Like shadow work is not merely something we do in our coaching sessions or in meditation. As vital as those things are, shadow work is how we show up every day. It's how we speak to people. It's the intentions we set. It's the kind of people we choose to associate with. It's the sort of work we do. It's our willingness to pay attention as we go about life and manage our mental state. It's let's say someone who's working as a prison warden. There was a chap here yesterday who was talking about one of his clients who works as a prison warden and how difficult he found that job. Ultimately, as much as that person is doing a service, their job is going to require them to do a lot of things that are quite unwholesome, right? They might be called on to get violent at times. And so no matter how much meditation and coaching they do, there's going to be a conflict there. So until they align their livelihood in such a way that they can build that congruency of mind, there's going to be conflict and they're not fully going to do their shadow work. So I've written about this in this short ebook here. It's a 45-page ebook. It's called The Way of Individuation, 7 Habits for Spiritual Development. Go into some depth there about the 7 habits. You can download that at this URL. I also talk about that on my podcast, episode 3. So feel free to check that out if you'd like to know more. But I am going to talk about them very briefly here because it sets the scene for what I want to talk about next. So any practice that can meaningfully move a person forward in the direction of individuation is always going to comprise of 3 cornerstones, at least in my mind. So you've got wisdom or understanding. This is like building this mental model of experience. Secondly, there's conduct, how to speak, how to behave, how to structure your livelihood. And thirdly, there's mental discipline. And so in the Abrahamic religions, that takes the form of prayer. Of course, in Buddhism, there you've got meditation. And so what I try to do with the 7 habits here is really build a model that uses those 3 cornerstones, but also brings on board an understanding of the unconscious mind. So it's not about saying what to do or merely saying what works. It's about saying why it works. And so it's my best attempt to draw on what I've used in my own practice, studying Buddhism, and also from the many psychologists and coaches I've worked with who I've been lucky enough to be guided by. And so this is the model I use. It's the model I use in coaching as well as for my own daily life. I won't go through the 7 habits now because that'll take ages, but you can read them there. Like I say, you can read my book as well if you'd like to learn more about those. What I will do though is give you some examples of how they might apply to integrating certain functions in the shadow. So for example, if you're someone who has elements of intuition in the shadow, some practices that can be very useful here are certainly active imagination. That's, what is that other than accessing intuition, right? But also the divination arts. So tarot, astrology, numerology. These arts are often dismissed as being, say, unscientific or assumed to be just ancient superstition. But when we bring on board an understanding of the unconscious mind, we can see how these arts actually reflect something back to us about ourselves, which we maybe weren't conscious of. And so in that way, they can be profoundly useful, especially for developing this intuition. For thinking, insight meditation, also skillful communication, which is habit 3. So this is where we make sure that we're always not just speaking the truth, but communicating the truth with our tone, with our bodies. Like, we have to be showing up in an authentic way all the time. And that also includes speaking what is purposeful, because if we're speaking from a place of unconscious craving, we might just be just saying whatever makes us feel good in that moment, but it's not actually serving a purpose. So if there's this thinking element in the shadow, we can use skillful communication to actually shine a light on that. If sensing's in the shadow, like for some of us INTPs or INFJs perhaps, practicing their attention is really powerful. And also with that, mindfulness. In fact, it's a part of mindfulness. So this is really about giving your attention to what is actually happening in the moment, rather than allowing your mind to be directed by conditioning. Assigning your attention to the 5 senses, the felt experience of what is actually happening right now. Sight, sound, touch. Great way to bring on board some sensing. And for feeling, loving kindness meditation, really powerful. It's a dedicated exercise where it's kind of like an active imagination, really, where we bring to mind a series of people, starting usually with someone we find very easy to be around, moving on to a stranger, and then to someone we find really difficult, like the shadow trigger. And for people who have feeling in the shadow, this can be a remarkably powerful way to help bring some of that to light. Also, again, with skillful communication. So yeah, part of that is to speak from a place of kindness, as simple as that sounds. It doesn't mean being nicey-nicey, because if we're acting nice, that means we're pushing something else away. Like, that implies a persona-shadow dynamic. But speaking kind means not pushing away what we find uncomfortable in other people. And so this is another example of how it's not just about doing the work with our coach or our therapist, but it's what we bring to our lives every moment of every day. Okay, so we've got 15 minutes left. So I think I've got some time to go into my bonus section here about shadow and community, but I would like to leave a few minutes at the end for questions. So I'll get through this pretty quickly. As I said, shadow work is vital for healthy community, because only the conscious mind can actually make a change. Only the conscious mind can choose to do something differently. If we're not bringing to light those shadow aspects, you just have the unconscious reacting to the unconscious. And we'll be seeking out community not from a creative perspective, but because part of us is trying to be resolved. Like, there's an unresolved feeling that is trying to come up for air, is trying to come back to baseline. And if we're not aware of it, it can blindside us. We might be in a perfectly wholesome group, but the energy we bring to it might not be appropriate. Or we might end up in a group that's actually exploitative. A cult, and a cult can be not just a spiritual group, it can be a workplace, it can be a friendship circle, it can be a political organization, any group where there's a codependent dynamic. which is basically what I've just said. But that said, those same experiences can be used as the fuel and the motivation for then doing the work, going near the shadow. Just going to talk for a few minutes on how certain functions in the shadow might seek out spiritual community, or might seek security in community. So introverted feeling might seek out community that dictates their values for them. Now, this is problematic because, well, not least because they might not be very sound values, but actually because, you know, is it really possible to have fixed values? Is it really possible to go about without ever changing your values? I would say no. I'd say it has to be a moving target all the time. So if we're outsourcing those values, then, you know, clearly we don't have a degree of conscious control over it, and that's going to be problematic. For extroverted feeling, it might be relying on others for guidance and seeking out, you know, the appearance of harmony. Like maybe a group where, okay, everyone's being very lovely and nice to each other, and it looks like something healthy, but appearances can be very deceiving. And in fact, often things are, you know, not only not what they seem, certainly in cults, right? Certainly in these exploitative spiritual communities, but are often the precise opposite of what they purport to be, because they're trying to compensate for a polarity. You know, maybe something that's actually quite dark has to present itself in a certain way, precisely to regulate and placate those unresolved feelings. In the case of introverted thinking, it might be a tendency to seek out quite dogmatic practices that are quite simple. Now, thinking back to my 7 habits model, the whole idea of that is that it's in support of your individuation. So it's not about saying this is the right way. It's about saying, okay, here are the principles and here's why they work. But that all said, even though, you know, kind speech is a pretty healthy universal concept, it's still down to each individual to then apply that in the way that works for them, to find that middle way. And that middle way is going to be not only different between different people, but it's always a moving target. Like I said, being kind is not the same as being nice or acting nice, because being kind is about a genuine way of being as opposed to merely acting something out. Moving on to extrovert thinking, you know, I mean, it's quite clear how this one might show up, right? Seeking out structure, seeking out opportunities for power. If that extroverted thinking is not integrated, then it's likely to find unwholesome ways of expressing itself. And so this exercise is useful because if we've ever found ourselves becoming involved in any kind of group that we later found out was exploitative in some way, whether it's a company we ended up working for or indeed a cult, this can give us some insight into how we actually got involved in this group, like what was actually in it for me. And it can be very hard to spot because it's like the idea that I, you know, wanted some like power, like that's just inconceivable, right? But you know, Jung was very clear about this, and so, you know, the facing up to the shadow requires a tremendous moral effort. You know, recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. We just don't want to go there, but when you do, it's like, I see it now. Oh, okay, what a relief. And you know, it doesn't excuse whatever you encounter. It doesn't let other people off the hook, but it does entirely change your perception of it. That you're no longer judging it as just inherently bad, as something that must be eliminated. You see, you know, the evil in the world as serving a kind of purpose, right? As weird as that might sound, it's not to say that we should be doing evil at all. And you know, integrating the shadow doesn't mean you go about doing evil. It means the opposite of that. It means taking ownership of the evil that's in you. And only through that can you actually cease doing it. I'll blitz through these. So introverted intuition, seeking out mystique and majesty. So maybe an ESTP with a NI inferior might well be attracted to things that look kind of mysterious and magical, but actually really aren't actually explaining anything about existence. NE might seek out unorthodox practices. SI might seek out tradition for tradition's sake, and maybe some kind of unhealthy structure as part of that. And SE might well seek out impulsive opportunities for sense gratification. So on that note, when it comes to groups and leadership, because we're all leaders here, whether formally or informally, and we're certainly all influencers. Some of us manage teams, some of us coach other people. And so the mark of a true leader, in my view, is that they are able to guide others in making their unconscious conscious. The alternative to that, the dark side of leadership, is that they leverage unconscious material in others as a means to suppress what they themselves aren't willing to go near. Now, it's all about taking responsibility for our own mind. Like, if we get caught up in one of these situations, we have to understand what it is about ourselves that brought us there. But it doesn't mean that what we've encountered is right or justified. And I would question whether if what a leader is doing is leveraging other people's unconscious minds to suppress their own unresolved issues, is that really leadership? It may look like leadership, it may build companies and so on, but I would question whether that is actually meaningfully moving us forward. We're just creating more chaos. So I'll end on a quote from 13th century Iranian teacher Shams Tabrizi. He said, "The real guide is the one who makes you see your inner beauty, not the one who wants to be admired and followed." Oh, there's also a Jung quote. I've actually already mentioned this one, but I'll let you read that for a moment. He ends by saying that shadow work is essential for any kind of self-knowledge. Because of course, if we haven't integrated the shadow, we may have an idea of self, sure, but is that really self-knowledge? Is that just a fixed image? So he's actually making the case that shadow work is the beginning of self-knowledge. Knowing yourself not just as a set of ideas, but as an experience, a dynamic and changing entity. So thank you very much for listening this last hour. I'm going to open up to questions now.
I'm going to jump in. Yeah, this is a great presentation. There's deep insight here, which is very impressive.
Thank you.
But on the other hand, you make some generalizations that I don't think are quite correct. And the first is that religion in general, but specific religions specifically, don't take into account the shadow. And by doing that, you're cutting yourself off potentially from sources that will give you even more to work with. Specifically, I'm going to talk about Judaism for just a second.
Mm-hmm.
We have a concept called the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer HaTov. And the Yetzer Hara is the evil inclination, and the Yetzer HaTov is the good inclination. And the teaching, to generalize it, is you can't defeat the evil inclination. What you can do is master it. Just as a sailing ship, masters the wind, not by defeating the wind, but by sailing with the wind. That's where the concept of sacred and profane comes from, is that which is sacred elevates or feeding the Yetzer Hara and turns it into goodness, whereas that which is profane just feeds the Yetzer Hara, And so what we talk about evil is when we just feed the Yetzer Hara. But if you would, when we talk about feeding that, to go to a Freudian term, we call it the libido. And those libidinal urges that we're suppressing are appetites. And that's the reason why, just like the necessity to breathe is core to our being, these appetites can't be suppressed. And so the more you try to suppress them, the more they try to express themselves. And that's what you're literally what you're getting at. And you've made a catalog of really, beautiful, inspirational sort of understandings of just exactly what religious practices do. But there is received wisdom over thousands of years where human beings have struggled with these questions, and you can look into what their struggles were and not get caught up in the magicality of it, and start looking into, okay, what are they actually doing? What's the design here? And that might give you some inspiration for your work.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I certainly agree that religions have dealt with the problem of evil in a useful way. I'm only vaguely familiar with the idea of the Yetzer Hara. My point is really that they don't have a concept of the unconscious in quite the way Jung did, and that there's, for example, this process of participation mystique, where when we're engaging with external objects,
it's just the problem. What the problem with making the generalization is you're generalizing into not knowledge you don't have. That's the problem. You have to be careful about stating these things before you actually really have dug into the nature of it. Because I spent 48 years as an atheist, and 10 of those years was being a Zen Buddhist, and I loved that until I found the edges of what it could. I call it now a one-trick pony. It has one trick, it does it really well, but it's just a one-trick pony. I got religious not through my own want, but through just slowly going through this beautiful stuff that you're going through, and then well, what's the source of this? How, and I don't want to eat up your time to covering it, but no, there's much to be understand, and you're really on the path. I'm really impressed, but at the same time, I want to caution you that don't be so judgmental, because part of what is leading these judgments is just not acquiring what they're trying to teach.
Who trying to teach what? Sorry, can you be specific?
See, we have to, I start ending up talking about Kabbalistic concepts and stuff like that. There's 3,600 years of Jewish thought that the rabbis of the 2nd and 3rd century spent 400 or 500 years discussing these issues and fighting them out and keeping both sides of the question. So the guys that agree, it wasn't just one position stated, but even the people who disagreed were written down so that we have that information till today. And if you would, we see it boiled down into you must and you shan't sort of a thing, but that's not the way it was ever crafted. And so if you look through that, there's a lot of information here. And the problem is that it takes years to crack into this information. You're not going to get it by reading a slide.
The Kabbalistic stuff is interesting. I'm sort of just starting to learn about it, actually, but it's possible it could have gone back way beyond.
One of the big experiences I had was as I walked into the school that I'm going to right now. It's the Academy of Jewish Religion in California. I've been going since 2015. And I walked into the door with this model of the human mind, and the rabbi looked at it and said, "Oh, that's just the Sephiroth diagram." And I'm going, "No, the guy who wrote this thing is a big time atheist. There's no way that this is the case." And over a couple of years, it's like, oh my God, this is the Sephiroth diagram with 3 elements missing, and those 3 elements are software.
I don't think that the religions, say, of the last 3,000 years that they are even the culmination of human knowledge at that time. Like it's highly conceivable that there was a lot of rich knowledge going back a lot longer than that got lost.
The thing is we have technology now. We have we have the ability of neuroscience and stuff like that. But what they had was a human emotional system, just almost exactly the same as ours. And they didn't have the distractions of TV and all the rest of this stuff. And so they literally studied how people behaved and why they behaved.
Honestly, I think that the ancient knowledge is probably far superior to what we have today. I think there's probably been a lot that's been lost, and we're sort of rediscovering it. And my aim is not to say that religions are bad or wrong, or even that they don't understand the unconscious necessarily, but that the way a lot of them are taught doesn't actually include the unconscious, and it, in fact, actually explicitly excludes it, because it says, you know, the point is the book, or is the, and I understand that there are many people who see beyond that, and actually it is invariably that the true sages of religion are those that actually did move beyond it and actually go, okay, this is not the point, it's what this is referring to and what this is allowing us to realize that's the point. It's not the ritual, it's not the book, it's what it brings out of us.
The ritual is really important to make it possible for sensing oriented people to connect to intuitive information, where they struggle to get to these intuitive concepts. The ritual opens that door for them, and each one of these aspects of religion has a purpose, and it also has its limits. And this is what I'm trying. Your seven steps are just literally, ultimately, this is the only thing that's missing on that diagram is this connection to God, and otherwise you've got it. I mean, that's how insightful what you've already talked about is. And I don't want to eat up all your time, so I'm gonna be quiet, but it would be nice to have a talk with you.
So,
what?
I think we're into overtime now, so it's fair game. I would like to.
I could share with you a Sephiroth diagram and explain this in terms of neuroscience, what's going on here, which makes my colleagues at school crazy, because it's like, what is this? But that's the INTP, right? The INTP is tries to, but you know, the concept of God is so irrational. There's a commandment called love God. And the problem is God, no name, no object. Okay, love is an emotion, and emotions need objects. It's an irrational commandment. It is taught in Buddhism at the very, very core, Mu. And so you have to understand that humanity has been struggling with this question all along, and we look at it in different ways. And I'm not trying to say every system is equal, but humans have this struggle, and we all are struggling this struggle. And you are really getting right at the core of that, and it's a beautiful thing to see.
Thank you very much. And I have a lot of respect for all the religions, and from what I have learned of Kabbalah and what I'm starting to learn. I mean, I've got tarot cards behind me. I'm generally quite new to all of the Kabbalistic side of things, but it's clear to me that they did have some idea of the unconscious, but it's not to, you know, I'm talking more about the way like religion is practiced.
That maybe because a lot of, well, particularly when religions start out, there's usually an esoteric and an exoteric side. The esoteric being the more inwardly focused, meditative, more likely to be more in touch with the unconscious, than the exoteric, how it's presented, say, to the community. Unfortunately, in the last 2,000 years in particular, the exoteric sides of many religions have dominated, and the esoteric side's been persecuted and pushed aside, and a lot of the mean, ultimately, that if you do that too much with a religion, and it's happening a lot with, certainly with Christianity, the Anglican Church, for example, which would have been my original tradition, has lost so much meaning that people are just falling away from it in droves because there's nothing there for them anymore. and seeking other, often less healthy alternatives. And interestingly, I've been following the Kabbalah myself for a very long time now, and I find the Tree of Life is such a remarkable diagram that can be used in so many contexts that I mean, I was very interested in your comments about this knowledge probably having been around for a lot longer than history books lead us to believe, and I'm very much of that view. I'm a scientist myself, but I've also got, I'm actually beginning to wonder if there was some advanced civilization before the last ice age, which was dispersed when the ice covered the earth, but then the knowledge was dispersed among the tribes who has fled to escape the ice. But then when the ice receded, there was enough residual knowledge for civilizations to spring up around the world at a very similar time, in a very short time frame, with a very similar level of knowledge. I mean, it doesn't seem to be possible any other way.
Yeah, I think there's just becoming overwhelming evidence of some very sophisticated civilization that existed a long time ago.
Yes.
And, you know, maybe this isn't the place to go there, but there's clues in the tarot that it goes back. I mean, it's not a medieval tool. It goes back way longer than that.
It does. Yeah, and it contains coded knowledge from very, very ancient times. If you know what to look for.
Yeah, you spend a lifetime studying it. That's for sure.
Yes. But also the other thing is the you called it moral strength, but I also call it brutal self-honesty when you're doing it on the individuation path, because you can't truly see yourself unless you actually can see without. It's very difficult to be honest with yourself without overly judging yourself. So you acknowledging that I've got these, you know, it's part of being human as you come in. With the shadow is there as a self-defense and protective mechanism, as well as a darker side of our psyche. And another of the issues of our modern society is the cult of almost adult, you know, what would you call it? Positivism, which is, if that goes a little bit too far, we're very reluctant, particularly in the West, to face up any emotional pain whatsoever. That you know, we go to the doctors and expect to come out with a pill to make the pain go away, whether that's psychological or physical.
Yes.
But with psychological pain, if you don't face up to it, and keep shoving it away, sooner or later it's going to spring up and overwhelm you completely, far more so than if you've been able to handle it in small steps.
Absolutely. You know, our suffering serves a purpose, like whatever it is.
Yeah.
But there's two types of suffering. There's needful suffering, the suffering that brings us forward, and then there's needless suffering, and that's suffering that we impose that has no benefit to us or anyone else, but especially to the one that we're imposing the suffering on. If we're imposing suffering, it's needless, and if we're tolerating needless suffering, then it's needless. And if you would, that's what really defines that divide between, if you would, the suffering that we perceive and allow, called tough love, versus the suffering that the heart is called, the spirit is called to do whatever is possible to intervene. And that you have to, the suffering, I mean, hunger is suffering, okay, but hunger also inspires us to do something about it. So if you just feed someone, then they're dependent. So you have to let them have that sensation so they can move forward. But if they cannot feed themselves and they cannot make it till tomorrow, then you have to step in to help them make it to that next day. And that is that in the Sephiroth world, right? That's the compassion of Chesed versus the strength of Gevurah.
Yeah, absolutely, very, very well said.
And tough love is tough. Tough love is tougher to watch someone suffer, because you know they need to suffer. They need to feel that so that it motivates them, because that's what pushes us forward. And that's also the reason why we cannot eliminate the Yetzer Hara, just like we can't eliminate pain, because someone who doesn't feel pain, you know, they start losing their limbs.
Yes.
I've yammered too
On
much.
that point, I think our draw is to a close. Thank you so much, Max. Extremely thought-provoking. And I look forward to going and having a look on your website and reading your 7 Habits work. Sounds absolutely fascinating. So thank you very much. Great, Stuart and David as well. Your questions really, really illuminating, and the discussion afterwards. But let's give Max a bit of a break before he joins the next session. And thank you so much for presenting, Max. You did a great job.
you.
Down for the next one.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Cheers now.
I found that very inspirational.
Yeah. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.